March 25th, 2024, a day that will forever live in the hearts and minds of Georgian football fans, because that was the day that this small post-Soviet nation managed to finally qualify for its first major international tournament, beating Greece 4-2 on penalties to claim the final playoff spot for the upcoming European Championships. Now, when most Americans think about Georgia, they don't think of the country itself. They think of the state with peaches and, occasionally questionable local elections. And if they do think of the country, they think of cheese bread, hachapuri, which is outstanding, uh, wine, Joseph Stalin wine, which is actually pretty good, by the way. I would highly recommend that. Uh, they don't think football. But what if I told you all that there was a time when Georgian football and Georgian footballers were so highly regarded by both domestic and foreign observers that they were referred to as the South Americans of the Caucasus? Hey, gang, this is Professor Matt, and this is the second of my longer historical pieces in preparation for the upcoming European Championships here at the Too Many Guys football channel. And today we're going to talk about Georgian football. And this may seem weird because, if you do know anything about the history of Georgia, you're probably saying, well, really Georgian football starts in like the 90s, right? It's, just over 30 years old. There you would be wrong. Uh, Georgia, like all of the various republics of the former Soviet Union, had its own particular brand of football within, granted, the sort of colonial context of the Soviet Union. And it was a distinctly different, vibrant, unique, uh, dare I say, ethnically distinctive brand of football. And a good way to sort of think about that or to sort of visualize it, and hopefully, Stead will put an image that I sent him here in the video. If you go to a fan guide for the big club team in Soviet Georgia, and still the biggest club in independent Georgia today, the Dynamo Tbilisi from 1960. So, right, the 1960 sort of fan preview guide. What what's really interesting and what strikes you is that there's these weird little sort of cartoons of all of the major players doing ballet or pirouettes, acrobatics, and indeed, the star striker, a caricature of the star striker of that team, Vatil Gronoberdze, doing a traditional Georgian folk dance, something called the kartuli. Uh, again, this may seem weird for most Westerners or people that weren't plugged in to not just Soviet football, but Soviet culture and politics in general. The reason for this is, and this goes back to what I was suggesting, in the intro, Georgian football, even though this club team played in the Soviet Vysshaya League, of the Soviet Premier League, with Russian, Ukrainian, Belarusian, Kazakh, Armenian clubs, they had a very distinctive, a very separate footballing identity that was at the same time Soviet, but also distinctly Georgian. And right, the pirouettes, the ballet, etc. That's speaking to, this moniker of, Dynamo Tbilisi and Georgian football more generally as being more akin to Brazilian, Argentine, Uruguayan, the football of South America, uh, than sort of their Russian and or Ukrainian counterparts, right? And I think I've said this before on the pod. The Soviet Premier League, the Soviet Vysshaya Liga, at its best, was kind of a self-contained version of the UCL, right? Because it was one league, but it was one league in one nation made up of many different nations, and indeed many different styles of football. And right, part of this, and this is what I mean that, Georgian football, this, beautiful, full of flair version of the game that was played in Georgia during this period was both distinctly Georgian, but also in a very real way, distinctly and deeply sort of Soviet. The Soviet Union was an empire. Let's rip the band-aid off. It was an empire, but it was a weird empire. It didn't function like the empires of the Western European capitalist countries, Britain, France, United States, etc. Because those empires were usually based on racial and ethnic difference, and in many ways, and we'll talk a little bit about this too, because the Soviets did this as well, but differently. The creation of very real racial, ethnic differences and racial ethnic hierarchies. But these distinctions were created to uphold unequal power relations. The Soviet experiment was a little different because, this, as my buddy Terry Martin says, the Soviet Empire was an affirmative action empire, right? The Bolsheviks seized power rather unexpectedly in 1917, and, all of a sudden find themselves the heirs to this giant, complex, multi-ethnic, Russian empire. And, right, Lenin and, a lot of the early Bolsheviks looked at Russian chauvinism, so Russian nationalism. One of the reasons probably why Vladimir Putin doesn't have very good things to say about my boy Lenin, uh, as the biggest threat, right? And so a Soviet nationality policy, weirdly enough offered by Joseph Stalin, of all people, uh, comes into play pretty quickly, right? And, Bolshevik Russia becomes the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, a state of nations. Uh, and, right, this nationality policy pretty much went as follows. The adage was national in form. So, right, each particular nation or people had the right to their own language, folk art, etc. But it had to have been socialist in content. So nationalist in form, socialist in content. And again, this included, the promotion of local languages, local socialist, readings of local history, etc. This included, again, stuff like education, cinema, but also included football. And so what you had pretty early on was very distinctive, very, separate, forms of football being played in this one country within this one league system. Uh, and right, we'll talk about what Georgian football was and why it was so distinctive. But I think we've talked about this in the pod, before, in regards to, Soviet Ukraine. Look, the football that gets pioneered in, Russia, the Russian Republic, and particularly by the big five Moscow clubs, Spartak, CSKA, Dynamo Moscow, Lokomotiv, Torpedo, was low block, low block, low block, right? These clubs, particularly Dynamo Moscow, gave the world the 4-4-2, particularly a very sort of robotic version of the 4-4-2, right? Versus the style of football that becomes popularized in Ukraine in the 60s and really in the 70s and the 80s with those Dynamo Kiev teams, where you essentially had, it's polar opposite. Russian clubs played low block, one route football. Ukrainian clubs played possession-based, attacking, sort of, dare I say, a Soviet variant of Dutch total football. And indeed, Georgian clubs, not just Tbilisi, uh, they crafted their own style that was unique from the Russian, from the Ukrainian, from the Belarusian, etc. Uh, Football in Georgia predates the Soviet Union, however. As far as we can tell, The first organized football matches in what is today Georgia took place sometime in the late 19th century. And it's a direct English input, so very similar to how the game shows up in other parts of the former Soviet Union, like Ukraine and indeed Russia itself. Matches were being played at the port of Poti, uh, first with English merchant teams, but then because the British owned steel and textile mills in the region, factory clubs. So, the game gets imported in the late 19th century, the late imperial era, directly from Britain. Uh, but it's really the Soviet period and the transformations that occur beginning in the late 20s and really into the 30s that jumpstart the game in the Georgian Republic, right? Because football, as in Georgia, as indeed it was everywhere in the world, is directly tied to industrialization. It's directly tied to urban modernity and mass migration. So football was being played in Georgia pre-revolution during the very early Soviet period. But right, the vast majority of the Georgian population was rural. Right, you don't have that much industry. You had these British-owned factories, but there are only a handful of them. But then in the 1930s, with the electrification of agriculture, the first 5-year plan, and then the second 5-year plan, this shifts, and the Georgian population, as indeed most of the Soviet population, becomes way more urban, right? And the ingredients for a thriving footballing culture and a thriving fan culture come into play. Dynamo Tbilisi, which was the flagship Georgian club in the Soviet Union, is founded slightly before this in 1925. And right, they their rise is pretty spectacular, right? Because organized Soviet football really only begins in again first 5-year plan, the late 20s and the early 30s. And right, the Moscow clubs dominate Soviet football in its early years. But Dynamo Tbilisi, they're kind of the outlier, the exception to this. They don't win anything during this period. In fact, up until the 60s, they got the moniker the crownless champions, right? Because they always fielded good squads. They just could never get over the line. They could not win anything. Uh, One of the reasons Dynamo Tbilisi, uh, their rise is so spectacular, right? And they, in 1936, get promoted to the Soviet Premier League, the Vysshaya Liga. And incidentally, they never get relegated. There are only 3 teams from the old Soviet League that never got relegated. Dynamo Kiev, Dynamo Moscow, and Dynamo Tbilisi. So clean sweep for the Dynamos in that sense. Even teams like Spartak and CSKA had bad periods. They got relegated. Vladimir Putin's club, Zenit, they were a trash outfit for most of the Soviet period. Right. So why does Dynamo Tbilisi manage to rise as quickly as they do, and why are they this successful? Well, they have an important patron. The head of the regional Georgian branch of the NKVD, which will eventually become the KGB, so the secret police, right? And if your team is Dynamo, that means it's a secret police team. Uh, was a certain guy by the name of Lavrenti Beria. Uh, Really horrible human being. Criminal, uh, rapist, actual rape man, but a degenerate football fan. He even played in his youth, and apparently he was actually fairly good. Uh, he becomes in charge. He becomes the head of the Georgian NKVD, and right, he pumps resources and material into this new club that kind of becomes the showpiece, not just for the Georgian secret police, but also for the Georgian Republic on the Soviet football stage. So in their early years, they have a rather important patron. Now, one of the reasons they don't ultimately break through and win the league is because just when they're sort of doing that, two things happen. First, World War II is coming, and that puts a brake on everything for obvious reasons. The other is Beria gets a promotion and he goes to Moscow and eventually becomes the head of the all union NKVD, the secret police. And, his patronage switches, right? Because he's not, a big fish in the small pond of Georgia anymore. He's the big dog in the entire Soviet Union. So the resources, the time, the energy, and the coercion, right? Because, he made sure if his club wanted a player, they were going to get that player one way or another. Uh, all of this leaves Dynamo Tbilisi, this sort of provincial club, and is then put into Dynamo Moscow to the point that after World War II in the late 40s and the early 50s, Dynamo Moscow pretty much owns the Soviet Premier League simply because their patron is Stalin's right hand man. He's his hatchet man. He's like probably the second most powerful man in the country. So, Dynamo Tbilisi, they're this, again, the crownless champions through this whole period. But because of Soviet nationality policy, because, they develop a sort of brand of football that is different from what's being played in Moscow and indeed what's being played in Kiev and Minsk, etc. As early as the 1930s, you see references in the Soviet sports press to Dynamo Tbilisi as the great Uruguayans. What the hell does that mean, right? What does Georgia have to do with Uruguay? Well, look, I mean, on the international stage in the late 20s and the early 30s, Uruguay owned, right? And they played a very distinctive, very open, you know, style of football as opposed to the traditional European countries. And right, they thrilled everybody at those early Olympics and indeed their first World Cup. Uh, the Dynamo Tbilisi and indeed the other Georgian clubs forwent. They did not embrace the sort of robot ball of the Muscovite clubs. They forged ahead with this really expansive, expressive, dare I say, aesthetically beautiful version of football that was more akin to, the South American game, right? The Brazil teams that we all love. Dinamo Tbilisi during the Soviet era looked a lot like those Brazilian teams, right? They had flair players, which, especially for the Muscovite clubs, that was unheard of, right? You didn't want your players to like go off script and have flair. You want them to do their job that was assigned to them. So, the Georgians were the Dinamo Tbilisi, they were the great entertainers of Soviet football, right? And beginning in the late 50s, something happens, right? Because in the 50s, after Stalin dies and Beria is removed from power, the stranglehold of the league by Dynamo Moscow is broken. You have Torpedo Moscow breaks out, a whole bunch of different clubs. But, these Russian clubs are still playing 4-4-2 robotic football. And indeed, it works. But then in the late 50s, 1958, Dinamo Tbilisi gets a new manager, a guy by the name of Andro Jadornia. And he goes off script. The Dinamo Tbilisi already had a reputation for playing this sort of more expressive version of football. Well, he says, look, this 4-4-2 robot stuff, this doesn't fit what I have to work with. So I'm going to switch it up. I'm going to go 4-2-3-1. Uh, I'm going to emphasize dribbling, and I'm going to emphasize, particularly in the front four, effectively free roles, right? I'm going to play with an out and out attack cam, number 10, but effectively all three of those guys, their role is interchanging. It's going to be free flowing. And this revolutionized the Soviet game because no one had seen anything like it, or no one had seen anything like it that worked. And indeed, it does work because in 1964, Dinamo Tbilisi are no longer the crownless champions. They win their first Soviet Premier League, and they do it in resounding fashion. And the league ends with them and Torpedo Moscow, which is the flagship Moscow club in the second half of the 50s, the early 60s, tied on points and tied on goal difference. So it goes down to a golden match, a winner take all at a neutral venue. Neutral venue being Tashkent, Uzbek, well, Uzbek SSSR, now Uzbekistan. And so you have this free flowing Georgian variant versus Muscovite robot ball. So it's not just Torpedo Moscow versus Dinamo Tbilisi. It's the Russian Republic and, dare I say, the center versus the Georgian Republic versus the periphery. And robot ball versus, you know, this expansive, free flowing, almost Brazilian esque version of football being played in the Caucasus. And this other brand, this brand from the periphery wins. Dinamo Tbilisi trumps Torpedo 4-1. The match isn't even close. They dance around the robots. And right, this team they're referred to as the Golden Boys. And right, it's not just, commentators in the Soviet Union that are noticing, hey, this little club from Georgia, they're doing something different from, the big establishment clubs in Moscow. Around this time, a French football magazine wrote a little article about Dinamo Tbilisi, and they said this: Dinamo has great players, and indeed they did. Their technique, skills, and playing intellect enables us to name them the best Eastern representatives of the South American footballing tradition. That's interesting. And this is where the moniker of the South American of the Caucasus comes from, right? It comes from this French article that is then reprinted in the Soviet press, right? Uh, Dinamo Tbilisi do okay for the rest of the 60s. They never reach the height of, what happens in 1964. And they're eclipsed later in the decade, particularly by Dynamo Kiev, who is playing their own version, really, of Soviet total football, for lack of a better term. But they hold on, and then in the mid '70s, you get a major shift and a new evolution of this particular, Caucasan brand of Soviet football. Another new manager comes up, Nordar Artakatis, who's the manager from 1976 to 1982. And right, he tinkers, right, because the 4-2-3-1 that was introduced in the late 50s, that's now been figured out. And other teams in the Soviet Union are starting to copy it and refining it their own ways. Uh, it's under Akatis that they switch to a 4-3-3, which can morph into a 4-1-2-2. Uh, right? And it takes a little while for these new tactics to get embedded. It takes a little while for this, new generation, which is going to be super talented, to sort of come together. But in 1978, they win the Soviet League again. So that's their second, Soviet title. And they win the Soviet Cup in both 1976 and 1979. But it's not really the domestic success that's so cool about this particular generation. It's what they do in Europe, right? Because all of a sudden now Dinamo Tbilisi are playing in continental tournaments, and they're in what would eventually become the Champions League in 1979. And in the first knockout stage, they take a major scalp. Late 70s, early 80s, when you think about the Champions League, you should think about one club, my club, Liverpool. Dinamo Tbilisi faces Liverpool in the first knockout round of the 1979-1980 uh, Champions League. They lose 2-1 in a very competitive match in Anfield. And then they absolutely beat down. And this is a good Liverpool team, guys. Beat down Liverpool 3-0 at the Dinamo Stadium in Tbilisi. But it's actually the next year that they get their biggest prize. The Cup Winners' Cup of 1980, 1981. Uh, Georgia, this Georgian club, Dinamo Tbilisi, becomes only the second Soviet club, the first being Dinamo Kiev, to get any kind of European silverware by winning the Cup Winners' Cup. 2-1 in the final against East German side Karl Zeiss Siena. But along the way, knocking out West Ham, Feyenoord, and Statue Bucharest. And right, this team, if you look at the personnel, this is like, I guess Georgia's, Soviet Georgia's sort of golden generation. You had midfielder David Kapani, who his game epitomized, the free flowing nature of Georgian football. He was the guy that had that free roll, but also, in some ways, very much a Soviet player. He was a technician. And right, he was defensively sound. He could attack and create, but he was also defensively solid. And then, right, the captain of that team, left back, then eventually center back, Alexander Shibadadze. And both of these guys are not only instrumental in the success of Dynamo Kiev, they are starters and fixtures of those Soviet Union teams that make it to the knockout stages of every tournament beginning in 1982 with the World Cup in Italy and, excuse me, in Spain. Italy won to 1988, where they lose the final of that Euros to effectively Marco Van Basten. I would, if I said they lost to the Netherlands, that would be not really true. Van Basten beat that Soviet team. The Netherlands didn't. So, yeah, you have this unique, distinctively Georgian, but nevertheless sort of Soviet uh, brand of football embodied by this one particular team. But by 1988, things are happening in the Soviet Union that are beyond football. Mikhail Gorbachev comes in 1985. He initiates perestroika, restructuring and introducing certain capitalist mechanisms into the Soviet economy. And look, the Soviet economy has been stagnant for at least 5, maybe 10 years. So some restructuring needed to happen. What this did, however, is make a kind of crappy situation 5,000 times worse. He also initiates glasnost, openness. And so now ordinary Soviet citizens could actually voice their discontent. Again, you took a crap situation, and especially now that the economy is tanking, you're actually making things worse. And in certain parts of the Soviet Union, this dissent takes the form of nationalism, right? All of a sudden, questions about, national sovereignty and, the relationship between the republics and Moscow and, the relationship between these other ethnic republics and particularly Russia gets magnified. And, this happens in the Baltic republics, in Western Ukraine, in Moldova. Georgia is not immune, however. And right, it's going to actually be Georgia that's going to rip apart the Soviet footballing structure, just as the Soviet Union is collapsing. It's the Georgians that, tear apart Soviet football. Because in 1990, Georgia is the first republic to take their clubs out of the Soviet League pyramid before the Baltic states, definitely before Ukraine, right? And they set up their own independent FA, uh, right? And applies for FIFA and UEFA membership, right? Because in the first, and really in some ways, only democratic election in Georgian history, these nationalists come to power, and immediately that they set about, breaking the ties between the Republic and Moscow, and this includes the footballing ties as well. This goes as far as renaming Dinamo Tbilisi, Iberia Tbilisi. Why Iberia? You guys are probably like, what the hell does Georgia have to do with Spain or Portugal? Iberia is an old, a very antiquated term for Georgia. And so, this new nationally minded, government that's, pulling Georgia and pulling Georgian clubs out of the Soviet orbit, decide to rebrand the big team, not Dynamo, which of course is a Soviet context or Soviet word or name, and rebranded this weird freaking antiquated name for Georgia. Literally translated to Georgian Tbilisi. Dynamo fans hated this, by the way. And then remember, something similar happened in Yugoslavia with Dynamo Zagreb. The nationalist regime in Croatia renamed it Croatia Zagreb, and the fans mutinied. They were like, "What the hell?" So that only lasts a couple of years. Georgia does achieve independence in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union. They are recognized, and they do get FIFA and UEFA membership in 1992. But football really isn't the thing that on most Georgians' minds. Remember what I said about the Soviet Union being an empire, but also being an affirmative action empire, and these sort of weird tensions there. So, in some cases, Soviet nationality policy uplifted local regional republics, as we've seen with Georgian and Ukrainian football. They were distinct from the imperial center. These same policies, though, were also used to do what most empires do, divide and conquer. So in a lot of Soviet republics, you had, let's say, Ukraine, but you had an autonomous Republic of Crimea within Ukraine. And so, the center could always play a periphery in the periphery off against their own periphery, right? Because Russian speakers in Crimea were always terrified that, man, if, Ukraine ever broke from the Soviet Union, we're fucked. Like, you'd play these different groups off on one another. And Georgia was no different. And Georgia was probably the most uh, problematic in so much that you had two regions, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, that both were their own autonomous republics. And when Georgia declared her independence from the Soviet Union, the Abkhaz, and especially the South Ossetians, right? Because, there are Ossetians in Georgia, but there were also Ossetians in the Russian Federation, or what was the Russian SSSR, take up arms and declare their own independence from Georgia. And they're backed by the Russian government. Right. So the early 90s, you have this ethnically fueled civil war in Georgia where there's war crimes committed by really all sides. And the fighting never really ends. I mean, Russian peacekeepers come into the breakaway regions, but what you get are effectively frozen conflicts, not unlike what's happening in what was happening in Ukraine before the invasion proper, in the so-called People's Republics in the East and Donbass, and what's going on, to this day in Moldova with Transnistria, right, where you have these republics, these states that aren't recognized by anybody, but remain viable because Russian boots are on the ground. And they're used as mechanisms to destabilize these former Soviet states. So you have, this ethnically fueled civil war. You have a politically fueled civil war because a lot of ordinary Georgians aren't all that pleased with these hyper nationalists that win these elections. And right, the economy is tanking. More about that in a second. So you have Georgians versus Ossetians, Georgians versus Abkhazians, but you also have Georgians versus Georgians. Right. And like I said, the economy is a mess. And it's a mess because it's a mixture of two things. A lot of it is, the Soviet legacy, right? The Soviet economy it ticked, it worked, but it worked effectively because it was never fully on the level. So there was always this like low level of corruption, which was just, it was allowed. It was, tolerated because if you didn't have it, stuff wouldn't function. So you have this kind of culture of kind of institutional corruption and cronyism, right? But then that mixed with like the worst aspects of neoliberal capitalism, because now money is God, and the more money you have, the better. Everybody. So, you have you have real violence, ethnically fueled and politically fueled civil war in the Republic. But you also have a situation where the former state-owned economy pretty much stops working overnight, and a handful of very well positioned, very shady ass individuals get all of it, seize the modes and means of production almost overnight in a not so transparent privatization. Uh, Improvisation schemes. And right, this is Wild West Jurassic Park capitalism. This is, winner take all. And, the Georgian economy still has not recovered from the collapse of the Soviet Union. In the 90s and in the early 2000s, it was particularly bad. You had, food crises, energy crises, etc. Right. But to this day, the economy still is not great. And right, if the economy isn't great, you're going to get more political and social breakdown, right? You have the mass migration of Georgians out of the country. A lot of them show up to, places like the United States. And you go to Northeast Philly, the best Georgian food you can have is, about 30 miles away from where I'm at right now. But a lot of them go, and where do they go? Well, same thing with a lot of post-colonial situations. They go to, where the empire was. So you have a lot of Georgians and a lot of potential Georgian footballing talent working, playing, growing up in Russia. And indeed, if you looked at the Russian national team before the invasion, there's some guys that easily could be playing for Georgia. The best example I could give you is the center back from Spartak Moscow, Georgi Zhakia. He's Georgian, guys. He's Georgian, Georgian, Georgian. So you have this sort of you have people moving. But again, you also have more political instability, right? 2004, you have the Rose Revolution, which was supposed to be like the corrective to the early 90s, and that ultimately went nowhere, right? Because a lot of the so-called reformers were just as corrupt as the people they took out. And then, right, that government that comes in after the Rose Revolution tries to get the two breakaway republics back, particularly South Ossetia, by force. And the Russians don't like this. And, there's a war where the Russians are just, outside the gates of Tbilisi until a ceasefire is finally agreed upon. So the economy's a mess, politically, socially, the country's a mess. There are oligarchs, right? These shady people. But here's the thing: it's kind of like I was saying with in terms of talent, and ordinary people leaving. The Georgian oligarchs, yeah, they can invest in Georgian football, but why would you when you can invest in Ukrainian or Russian football? You can make even more money. So the money is not in Georgia, and Georgian football suffers. I mean, the quality of domestic football in Georgia, even now, is pretty trash. And a lot of the traditional teams from the Soviet era, academies close. In some cases, these clubs go bankrupt. Dynamo Sukhumi, that right was in the Soviet Prashaya Liga, the first league, for a long time. They didn't even play in the Georgian Championship because technically that's in Abkhazia and they're doing their own goddamn thing. So they don't even have the Moldovan situation where even though technically Sheriff is in a breakaway self-proclaimed state, they still play in the Moldovan league. Some of these clubs don't even play in Georgia. Yet, if you look at the 90s and the early aughts, for all of these disadvantages, Georgian football is still thriving and there's still Georgian talent. It's just playing someplace else. Guys like Levion Kobayashvili, excuse me, I turned him to Japanese man. Played in the Bundesliga for Freiburg, Schalke, and Hertha Berlin. Shota Aradadze, right, who is the national team's leading goal scorer, right? He played in the Netherlands. And then, right, my boy, Kaka Kaladze, uh, mayor of Tbilisi, by the way. I only just found this out. He started out at Dynamo Tbilisi. Valery Levanovsky, who was the manager of Dynamo Kiev, was aware of his existence, plucked him from Tbilisi pretty early. Was the starting left back on those Dynamo Kiev teams that beat the likes of Barcelona, Real Madrid, etc. in the Champions League, those Rebrov Shevchenko teams of the late 90s. Uh, and then got his big money move with his buddy, Shevchenko, to Milan. And even though he was never a nailed on starter with Milan, he's a really important player on those Milan teams in the odds that won the Champions Leagues under, Carlo Ancelotti. But the national team wasn't very good. There were some really good individual players, but because the domestic league was so messed up, because the political and economic instability, it's hard starting from scratch. And in the case of former Soviet republics, as indeed it is the case in most of the post colonial world, you go ask sub Saharan African national teams and FAs about this. It's really hard. You have to crawl before you walk and before then you run. And right, like I said, they were at a disadvantage too in terms of players. Some very talented Georgian players mysteriously got Russian passports. But in the late 2000s, something started to happen. And what you're seeing and what's happened this last year being I think the culmination of this is that you're seeing the development of a new golden generation of Georgian football, not centered around Dynamo Tbilisi because the realities on the ground have changed. You have young Georgian players playing throughout Europe and certainly before 2022 in Russia, but not necessarily getting Russian passports. Some examples: the starting goalkeeper Georgian Mardashvili, who at Valencia, who I think is criminally underrated. I think he's the most underrated good keeper in Europe at the moment. Midfielder Zarko Davishvili at Bordeaux, formerly at Rubin Kazan. That's where I got to know him, and he's a really good young player. Striker Georgios Makatadze at Metz, right? And he's the leading goal scorer of this current crop. But he's done it all in the last like couple years, right? All of these guys are under 25 years old. So they're just scratching the surface of their potential. And of course, my man like Sheila, Georgian Jesus, Kravicha Kravachkila, who I saw when he was a 16-year-old make his debut at Lokomotiv Moscow with his full ass beard. And I was like, this guy's not 16 years old. That's bullshit. Right. But then, like, yeah, I guess he really is. Then he went to Rubin Kazan and, what he did last season at Napoli. And he's probably going to get a move this summer. Maybe. We'll see. So you have this really interesting core of young Georgian players, all under the age of 25, playing all over the world. And it's just coming together, all at once. And you saw signs of this a couple years ago, 2018, right? Georgia is the first team that was promoted from Nations League D, which is where they were on merit, right? I mean, they were minnows, to League C. In 2020, during World Cup qualifying, yeah, they didn't make the playoff cut, but they did the double against Sweden, including beating them 2-0 in Stockholm, played them out to park. And by the way, cost Sweden pretty much a spot in that, World Cup. And then 2021, they appoint former Bayern Munich and French national team man Willie Sagnol as the manager. I remember hearing this and I was like, "Oh, Willie Sagnol's taking the Georgia job? What's going on here?" But hey, the rest was history. They've improved every year in the Nations League. They're getting more and more results in terms of, qualifying. And because of their success in the Nations League, they got into the qualifying playoffs this go around, beating Luxembourg and improved Luxembourg 2-0 in the first playoff. And then, of course, the famous result on March 25th, the penalty kick shootout against Greece. So, how is Georgia going to do with these Euros? I have no idea. Well, I do. I have some thoughts. And if you're interested in those thoughts, tune in to the episode where I guess we all discuss, the Euros and our feelings about it. And definitely tune in to my own strictly Eastern European Euros preview, which should be coming out, I imagine, a couple days before the tournament kicks off on the 14th. But regardless of how they do, the fact that they're there is incredibly important. Right. We all love debutantes at major tournaments. And my hope is with this video to sort of highlight this is a debutante which we don't really think of, right? Because Georgia only became a independent state, a little over 30 years ago, with a rich, distinctive footballing history, culture, and tradition. The South Americans of the Caucasus are back. And right, we'll see what this new golden generation, what they have to do, or what they're going to say in a couple weeks. Anyway, good people, this is Professor Matt for the Too Many Guys football show. Uh, Look out for my Eastern European specific Euros preview and look out for our Euros preview, which should be coming out shortly. Right. And the next time you see me on one of these long form ones, I'm going to be shifting gears, right? Because the Copa America is coming up and we're going to be talking about politics, the political history of Argentine football. So take care, do well, avoid evil, and you guys know what to do. Like, comment, subscribe, and make sure you eat some hachapuri. Peace.